She stepped off the stagecoach, took one look at the man waiting for her, and said the words she had rehearsed every mile of the journey. "There's been a mistake. I'm not the pretty bride you ordered." Her voice didn't shake. It broke. Thomas Reed said nothing for a long moment. The whole town of Silver Creek was watching, waiting for him to send her back. He stepped forward instead. "You're my everything," he said quietly. And Eleanor Hayes, who had never once in her 25 years been told she was enough, felt her knees nearly give out. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach rolled into Silver Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1887, and the dust it kicked up hadn't even settled before half the town had gathered at the end of Main Street to watch. They weren't there for the mail. They weren't there for supplies. They were there for Thomas Reed's bride. Word had spread the way. Word always spreads in small Wyoming towns, through back fences and general store counters and Sunday church whispers, and by the time the coach pulled in, there were maybe 40 people positioned along the wooden sidewalks and hitching posts, all of them trying their best to look like they just happened to be there for other reasons. Thomas Reed stood apart from them. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by years of open sky and honest work. He wore his good shirt, the dark blue one he'd only put on twice in the past 3 years, and his hat was new. His boots were cleaned. He had his hands clasped behind his back, which anyone who knew him understood was the way he stood when he was trying not to let anyone see that he was nervous. Nobody said a word to him. They knew better. The coach door opened. A trunk came out first, tied with fraying rope. Then a smaller bag patched along one seam. Then a hat box that had seen better decades. And then she appeared in the doorway, this woman who had traveled over 900 miles from Ohio to marry a man she had never met. Eleanor Hayes. The first thing people noticed was that she was small. Not frail, but compact, the kind of small that suggested a woman who had spent her life carrying more than her size suggested she should be able to. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been cleaned and pressed, but couldn't hide that it was old. Her dark hair was pinned up neatly, her chin was lifted, and then she stepped down into the light, and the crowd saw her face. There were no gasps. The people of Silver Creek were not cruel, most of them. But there were looks exchanged. Glances that lasted just a beat too long before their owners remembered their manners and found somewhere else to look. The birthmark covered most of her left cheek. It was a deep, reddish-brown irregular at the edges, spreading from just below her eye to the corner of her jaw. It had been part of her face since the day she was born. It would be part of her face until the day she died. Eleanor had known the looks her whole life. She had learned to read them in the first half-second, the flinch, the overcorrection, the careful blankness that people arranged over their faces when they realized they'd been caught staring. She could read them the way a farmer reads weather, automatically, without thinking. She read every single one of them now, as she stood in the street in Silver Creek, Wyoming, holding her hat box and her threadbare dignity. And she thought, this was a mistake. This was always going to be a mistake. Thomas stepped forward. He was maybe 10 feet away when she really looked at him for the first time. Not the way she'd imagined him from his letters, which had been precise, careful letters, the letters of a man who chose his words deliberately, but as an actual human being standing in actual sunlight. He was older than she'd expected. His face was serious. There was something about his eyes that she couldn't immediately name. He stopped in front of her, and Eleanor Hayes, who had promised herself she would hold her head up and be brave, looked at this man who had paid for her passage and was now about to discover he'd gotten something he hadn't bargained for, and she said the words that had been sitting on her chest since Columbus. "There's been a mistake." Thomas didn't speak. "I'm not—" She swallowed. Tried again. "I'm not the pretty bride you ordered." It came out like an apology, like she was confessing to a crime, like she was standing in front of a man she owed something to and didn't have the means to pay. The town was very quiet. Thomas Reed looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change. His eyes moved over her face, not the way the crowd's eyes had, not with that quick assessment and polite retreat, but slowly, the way a man looks at something he's been waiting to see. Then he said, "You're my everything, just that." 4 words spoken quietly without flair or performance. Eleanor stared at him. He reached down, picked up her trunk, and said, "The wagon's this way." And he walked. For a moment, Eleanor didn't move. She stood there with her hat box and her confusion and 40 sets of eyes on her back, and she tried to understand what had just happened. Then she followed him. The ride to Reed Ranch took 40 minutes on a good road, and Thomas drove in silence for the first 10 of them. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, watching the land open up around them. Wyoming in September was a thing she hadn't been prepared for. Ohio had trees that crowded close and skies that felt contained. This was different. This was sky that went on until you couldn't trust your own sense of distance. She found it unsettling. She found everything about this unsettling. Finally, because she couldn't stand the silence anymore, she said, "You don't have to pretend." Thomas glanced at her. "Pretend what?" "That what you said back there was something you meant." He kept his eyes on the road. "I meant it." "Mr. Reed." "Thomas." "Thomas." She stopped, tried to organize her thoughts into something coherent. "Your advertisement didn't ask for much. I understand that. But the women who responded to advertisements like yours, the ones who actually get chosen, they're not women who look like me. So whatever agency matched us, they made an error somewhere, and I think we should talk about what happens now before we've wasted more of each other's time." He was quiet for a moment. "The agency didn't match us," he said. She frowned. "What?" "I wrote directly to a women's center in Columbus. The woman who runs it wrote back. Said there was someone who'd read my letter and wanted to respond. I wrote to you. You wrote to me. We did this ourselves." Eleanor thought about that. "The woman at the center, Mrs. Aldridge." "That's right. She never told me you knew she had sent my letter. She didn't need to. I'm the one who asked to see all the responses. Yours was the only one I answered." Eleanor turned to look at him fully. "Why?" Another pause. "Because you wrote the truth," he said. "Every other letter I got told me what the woman thought I wanted to hear. Beautiful descriptions. Accomplished women. Every letter trying to sell something. Your letter told me you were a decent cook, but not a great one. Told me you could sew, but didn't enjoy it. Told me you'd worked in a laundry for 3 years, and your hands showed it." He paused. "You told me you had a birthmark on your face, and that if it was going to be a problem, I should say so before either of us wasted a train ticket." Eleanor felt something complicated move through her chest. "That was not a flattering letter," she said. "No," Thomas agreed. "It was an honest one." She looked back at the road. "You could still send me back," she said quietly. "Nobody would blame you." "I'm not sending you back." "Mr. Reed." "Thomas." She closed her eyes briefly. "Thomas, I'm trying to give you an exit before this becomes complicated." "I don't want an exit. You haven't known me for an hour. I've been reading your letters for 4 months." She didn't have an answer for that. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the first 10 minutes had been. The ranch was larger than she'd expected. Eleanor didn't know why that surprised her. His letters had mentioned the size of the operation, had been specific about the number of cattle and the acreage. But reading numbers on paper and standing in front of the reality of them were 2 different experiences. The main house was 2 stories, solidly built, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There were outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a large barn. There was smoke coming from the cookhouse chimney. 3 ranch hands were working in the yard when the wagon pulled in. They stopped and looked. Thomas climbed down first and then offered his hand to help Eleanor down. She took it because her legs had stiffened on the ride, and it was a practical matter, not a sentimental one. The ranch hands watched. One of them young, maybe 19 with a sunburned face, leaned toward the man beside him and said something Eleanor couldn't quite hear. She heard the word marked, though. She always heard that word. Thomas heard it too. He didn't look at the young hand right away. He walked Eleanor to the porch, said, "I'll show you the house in a few minutes. Make yourself comfortable up here." And then he turned and walked back toward the yard. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched. She couldn't hear what Thomas said. He spoke quietly, the way he seemed to do everything, without performance, without volume. But she watched the young hand's face go from careless to uncomfortable to genuinely ashamed in the space of about 30 seconds. Then Thomas said something else, and the hand nodded and went back to work. Thomas came back to the porch. "You didn't have to do that," Eleanor said. "I know. He's going to resent me now. He'll manage." Thomas opened the front door. "Come inside. I'll show you the kitchen." She followed him in. The house was not what she expected either. It was clean, which surprised her. She'd half expected the disaster zone of a bachelor who'd been living alone for too long, and there were small touches that suggested someone had made an effort. A vase on the kitchen table with dried wildflowers. Curtains in the kitchen window that were newer than the rest of the furnishings. A rocking chair near the fireplace that was positioned at an angle that caught the light perfectly. Eleanor stopped at the rocking chair. "This chair," she said. "What about it? The way it's placed, you can see both the window and the fireplace from it." "Yes." Someone thought about that. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "My mother put it there, before she died." Eleanor stepped back from the chair. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "It's all right," he said. She would have liked the idea of someone sitting in it. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the chair, and she saw it then, that thing she hadn't been able to name in his eyes back in town. It wasn't coldness the way people described him. It wasn't distance. It was the particular expression of a man who had learned to live with empty space and had gotten very good at it. A man who had arranged his life so neatly around all the things that were missing that he no longer noticed the shape of them. She recognized it. She lived in it herself. "I'll make something for supper," she said quietly. "It won't be impressive, but it'll be hot." Something shifted in his face. "The pans are in the lower cabinet," he said. "I'll be outside if you need me." She made a simple stew because it was what she knew how to do well, and she was too tired to attempt anything ambitious. She found vegetables in the cellar and salt pork in the pantry, and a Dutch oven that had clearly been used within the last week, which meant Thomas actually cooked for himself, rather than relying entirely on the cookhouse, which told her something about him. She filed away without examining yet. While the stew cooked, she explored the kitchen the way any sensible woman would when entering a house she was expected to run. She found the organization immediately. Everything had a system. Spices alphabetized on the shelf. Canned goods sorted by type. Tools hung in a specific order. Not the organization of a man who was fussy, but the organization of a man who worked a large operation alone, and had learned that knowing where everything was saved him time he didn't have. She could respect that. She had been organized out of necessity her whole life. He came in when the light outside started going gold, and washed his hands at the basin, and sat at the kitchen table without being asked which she appreciated. It meant she didn't have to navigate the awkward question of whether she was serving him or eating with him. "It smells better than I expected," he said. "I told you it wouldn't be impressive." "I said better than I expected. That's different." She brought 2 bowls to the table and sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Eleanor picked up her spoon and Thomas picked up his, and they ate. "Tell me about Ohio," he said after a while. She glanced up. "Why?" "Because we've been writing letters for 4 months, and I'd like to hear what your voice sounds like when you talk about where you're from." Eleanor set her spoon down. "That's a very specific thing to want to know." "I'm a specific kind of man." She considered that. "Ohio is flat," she said. "But there are parts of it that are beautiful if you know where to look. The river in spring. The way the light comes through the birch trees in October." She paused. "I won't miss the factory noise. I'll miss the river." The laundry was near the river. 2 blocks. We walked there sometimes in the evenings. She picked her spoon back up. What will I miss more than I expect to? He thought about it. The green, he said. People who come from the east always say that first. Wyoming is beautiful, but it doesn't look like the east. Takes about a year before you stop waiting for the trees to come back. And after a year, you stop looking for what isn't there and start seeing what is. Eleanor ate a spoonful of stew. That's not a bad philosophy, she said. It works for landscapes, he said. I think it works for other things too. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And Eleanor Hayes, who had been bracing herself for the first crisis of this marriage since she stepped off the stagecoach, felt the tension in her shoulders drop just slightly for the first time in 900 miles. He showed her the rest of the house after supper. The parlor, which had books she immediately catalogued. The spare room upstairs, which he said was hers for as long as she wanted it that way, and he said it without any implication or apology, just as a fact. She stood in the doorway of the spare room. It had a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which she had always loved, and she said, "You mean it, that this room is mine." I said it. Some men say things like that and mean something different. I know, Thomas said. I'm not some men. She looked at the window. I believe you, she said. I'm not sure why yet, but I believe you. That's enough for now, he said. Sleep when you're ready. Breakfast is early on a working ranch. How early? 5. She turned around. I grew up on a farm. 5 is fine. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. Good night, Eleanor, he said. Good night, Thomas. He pulled the door closed and she heard his footsteps down the hall, and she stood alone in a room in Wyoming that smelled like pine and clean linen, and she pressed her hand flat against her left cheek, the way she did when she needed to feel the outline of herself. She was still herself. She was still here. Against everything, she was still here. The first week passed the way first weeks do in adjustments and discoveries, in the slow accumulation of evidence about who a person actually was beneath the impression they made. Thomas worked from before dawn until past dusk. That was simply who he was. But he always came inside for the midday meal, and he always sat at the table, and he always talked. Not a lot. He was not a man who talked for the sake of sound, but enough. Real things. The state of the herd. What needed fixing. The weather that was coming. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers, which she had discovered was a rarer quality than it should have been in men. Eleanor worked too. That was simply who she was. She learned the house. She learned the root cellar and the smokehouse and where the good firewood was stacked. She learned which of the ranch hands were reliable and which were careless, and she learned it by watching, not by asking Thomas, because she wanted her own knowledge. She met the ranch cook, a man named Hector, who was deeply suspicious of her presence in the kitchen and made his feelings known through the angle of his shoulders and the way he responded to everything she said with a slow blink. She brought him a slice of the apple cake she made on Thursday. By Friday, his shoulders had relaxed. She met the foreman, a weathered man named Cal, who had apparently worked for Thomas for 11 years, and seemed to regard himself as the ranch's unofficial historian and atmosphere gauge. He tipped his hat to her the first time they met and said, "Ma'am, he needed someone. Glad you came." She said, "I'm not sure I'm what he needed." Cal said, "He chose you, didn't he?" She didn't have an answer for that either. The first time Silver Creek got to her was a Wednesday. She had ridden into town with Thomas to collect supplies, and she had stood at the counter of the general store while Thomas spoke with the owner, and the owner's wife had come out from the back and stopped when she saw Eleanor, and done the thing, the look, the overcorrection, the too bright smile that appeared a half-second too late. "Oh," the woman said, "you must be Mr. Reed's. You're the new wife." "Eleanor Reed," she said. "Yes. How lovely that you've settled in. Are you finding Wyoming to your liking?" "Very much," Eleanor said. The woman kept talking. Eleanor kept answering. And the whole time Eleanor was watching the woman's eyes go back to her cheek, and then away, and then back with the helpless, compulsive quality of someone who knows they shouldn't but can't quite stop themselves. Eleanor had mastered the ability to hold a conversation while simultaneously being somewhere else entirely in her head. She had developed this skill over 25 years. She deployed it now. When they were back on the wagon, Thomas said, "You're quiet." "I'm fine." "Mrs. Howell is a kind woman," he said. "She doesn't mean anything by it." Eleanor looked at him. "I know she doesn't. The ones who mean something by it look different." He processed that. "How do they look? Certain?" she said. "The ones who are just uncertain don't bother me much anymore." A long pause. "I'd like to know," Thomas said, "if something ever bothers you that I should know about." She looked at the road ahead. "Why?" "Because it's my job to know." "It's not." "It is," he said, "whether you believe that yet or not." She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing for a moment. "There was a man at the feed store," she said finally. "He stared for too long." "Which man?" "The one with the red vest." "Daniels," Thomas said. "I'll speak to him." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." And he did. She didn't see the conversation, but the next time she went into town, Daniels looked at the floor when he saw her, which was not exactly the response she would have chosen, but was a significant improvement over the alternative. 3 weeks in a ranch hand named Boone made the comment. Eleanor had been crossing the yard with a basket of kitchen herbs, and Boone and another man named Garrett were repairing a fence post nearby, and Boone said something to Garrett that he said at a volume clearly calculated to be heard. He said, "Boss must have been real desperate." Garrett shushed him. Too late. Eleanor kept walking. She went inside and put the herbs on the kitchen table, and stood there with both hands flat on the table surface for a moment, not breathing quite right, doing the thing she did, where she waited for the feeling to pass through her rather than fighting it. Then she heard the door. Not the front door. The yard door. And then Thomas's voice out near the fence, very quiet the way it always was when he was most serious. She moved to the window. She couldn't hear the words. She could see Boone's face, though. It went through about 6 different expressions in the space of a minute. Defensive, then resentful, then uncomfortable, then something that might have been genuine. Thomas said something else. Boone took off his hat. Then Thomas said, "Anyone who disrespects my wife has no place on my land." She heard that part. He'd raised his voice just enough for her to catch it. She stepped back from the window and stood in the kitchen and pressed her hand against her cheek and thought, "Stop it. You don't need this. Don't need any of this." Because she'd spent 25 years making sure she didn't need anything from anyone, and 1 month in Wyoming was not long enough to undo that. But her eyes were burning. She turned back to the herbs and started sorting them, and she told herself it was the onions, even though she hadn't gotten to the onions yet. The letters started the 3rd week. Thomas mentioned them over supper, which was how Eleanor was beginning to understand his communication style. He brought up important things over food, as though the presence of the table between them made hard topics easier. "I've been getting some correspondence," he said, "from my attorney in Cheyenne." She looked up. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing immediate. There's a company out of Denver that's been sending representatives through the territory. They've been offering to buy out ranchers' water rights." She frowned. "Why would anyone sell their water rights?" "The offers are generous," he said. "Short term. The contracts they're presenting Cal had a look at one. There's language buried in them that would restrict a rancher's access to his own water during drought years. Give the company priority. That would effectively ruin a ranch," Eleanor said. "Several ranches have already signed." "Can they get out of the contracts?" "That's what the attorney's looking at." He took a bite of bread. "I want you to know because you should know what's happening with the land you live on." Eleanor set down her fork. "You're telling me because I have a right to know, not because you need my help. I'm telling you because I'd want to know if I were you," he said. And because you're not a woman who does well without information. She picked her fork back up. No, she agreed. I'm not. What do you think? He said. About the water rights situation. She looked at him. You're asking me? I just said I was. She thought for a moment. Whoever is behind the company understands ranch economics well enough to know that drought years are when ranchers are most desperate for cash and least able to fight contract terms. The language in the contract is probably specifically designed to trigger in those years. She paused. If they've already gotten several ranches to sign, they have a business model. They're not testing the water. They've already planned for it. Thomas looked at her steadily. That's exactly what the attorney said. He told her. She felt warmth rise in her face that had nothing to do with her birthmark. I worked in a factory, she said. I learned to read contracts when they changed our piece rate terms. You learn to look for the language that sounds reasonable but means something else. That's a useful skill. It cost me 3 weeks' wages arguing with a supervisor, but yes. She looked down at her plate. It's a useful skill. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Eleanor. She looked up. I'm glad you're here, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever this becomes between us, I'm glad you're here. The table was between them. The kitchen light was doing its September evening thing, going amber and long-shadowed. Outside, the first coyote of the night said something to the darkening sky. I'm beginning to be glad too, Eleanor said carefully. Thomas nodded once, as though that was exactly enough. The letter arrived on a Saturday. Thomas brought it in from town with the other mail sorted through everything at the kitchen table the way he did, and then set one envelope aside separately. Eleanor noticed but didn't ask, because she had learned there was a timing to Thomas Reed. There was always a timing, and pushing ahead of it got you nowhere. He waited until she had sat down with her mending. Then he said, You should know that someone in Silver Creek has written to a woman in Denver about our marriage. Eleanor looked up slowly. What kind of letter? A gossip letter from the language, describing your... He stopped, chose the next word carefully. Your appearance, and saying that people in town think I married beneath myself. She held very still. The woman in Denver, she said. Who is she? The pause before he answered told her more than the answer did. Someone I knew before, Thomas said. Some years ago. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it. Something like the face of a man who has a door. He's been careful to keep closed and has just discovered someone's knocked on it from the outside. How well did you know her? Eleanor asked. The kitchen was very quiet. Well enough, Thomas said, that her knowing I'm married is going to create a situation. Eleanor set her mending down. Thomas. Yes. Tell me from the beginning. He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to. Then he said, Her name is Clara Whitmore, and something in his voice when he said the name. Not tenderness exactly, but the weight that remained after tenderness has been burned away. Told Eleanor Hayes that she was about to learn something that would change everything she thought she understood about the man sitting across from her. She folded her hands in her lap. And she waited. Be here. She's coming, the letter said. She wanted me to warn you. I thought you deserved to know before she arrived. The letter was from a man named Porter, who apparently was one of Thomas's few actual friends in the territory, and who had apparently run into Clara Whitmore at a Denver hotel and heard her talking about her plans. Thomas told Eleanor all of it. Clara Whitmore. 28 years old now, the daughter of a Denver banker. She and Thomas had known each other when Thomas was building the ranch. This was 7 years ago now, and they had made plans. Real plans. Plans that Thomas had believed were as solid as the land he was working. Then Thomas had come back from a cattle drive to find that a fence post repair had gone wrong. When he wasn't watching, a section had fallen. The herd had gotten into unfenced land during a thunderstorm, and Thomas had gone after them on a night when the ground was treacherous, and he'd come back with his shoulder broken in a way that healed badly with scarring where the break had been poorly set, and with a limp that lasted 2 years. Clara had come to visit. She had sat across from him at this very table, and she had said very gently that she didn't think she could do this, that she had thought she could. But seeing him like this, she realized she had been building her future around a different version of him, that she hoped he understood. Thomas had told her he understood. He had not understood. He had over the following years very carefully rebuilt himself around the understanding that this was simply a thing that had happened, and that it meant only that some doors closed permanently, and that a man's job was to work with the doors that remained open. "The limp is gone," Eleanor said. "You don't limp. Healed over time. The shoulder still has its moments in cold weather." She was quiet for a moment. "And she heard you'd married. According to Porter's letter, she heard you weren't—" He stopped again. "That I wasn't pretty," Eleanor said. "That's the word. You can say it. That you weren't what she would have expected me to choose. And she's coming to see about it. That appears to be her intention." Eleanor sat with this information for a long moment. There was a fire in the range. The house made its small nighttime sounds. Somewhere in the distance, one of the horses moved in the barn. "Are you still in love with her?" she asked. The question landed in the room and stayed there. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Eleanor respected that she would have been more alarmed by a fast answer than a slow one. "No," he said finally. "But I'm not sure I'm all the way past her either. I think there's a difference." "There is," Eleanor said. She picked her mending back up. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You deserve to know." "Yes," she said. "I did." She sewed 2 stitches. 3. "Thomas." "Yes." "Whatever she says when she gets here, whatever she tries to do, I need you to know that I am not going to fight for a position I was never meant to hold." She kept her eyes on her sewing. "If you discover that what you want is her, and not this, I need you to tell me honestly. Not kindly, honestly. I can survive honest." The fire popped. "Eleanor," Thomas said. "Yes." "I chose you. You chose my letter," she said. "You hadn't met me yet." "I chose you," he said again. "The letter was how I found you. That's different." She looked up. He was looking at her with that expression she still hadn't found the right word for, the one that had started in his eyes back in town, on the day she arrived, and had been deepening ever since, like water finding its level. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he agreed. She looked back down at her mending. Her hands were steady. She was surprised, and then she wasn't. Outside, Wyoming was going dark and enormous and full of stars, and Eleanor Hayes, who had arrived in Silver Creek believing she was a mistake, was beginning to suspect cautiously, carefully, against every instinct she had built over 25 years, that she might have been exactly what she was supposed to be. The woman who fit. Not into Thomas Reed's dream, into his actual life. And those she was learning were entirely different things. The letter from Clara arrived 3 days later. It was addressed to Thomas. It was written in a hand that was precise and practiced and elegant. Eleanor saw it on the table when she came in from the garden. She did not open it. She did not move it. She made coffee and waited. And she told herself that whatever came next, she had survived worse. She told herself that. She was almost certain it was true. The letter sat on the table for 2 hours before Thomas came in. Eleanor had not moved it. She had not touched it. She had made coffee, and then she had started a pot of beans because something about having her hands in useful work made the waiting easier, and she had watched the letter from the corner of her eye, the way you watch a dog. You're not sure about, not frightened exactly, but not looking away either. Thomas came in through the yard door, washed his hands, and stopped when he saw the envelope. He picked it up, read the front, set it back down. "It came this morning," Eleanor said. I see that. He didn't open it immediately. He poured himself coffee, sat at the table, and held the cup in both hands. Then he picked the letter up again, opened it cleanly, and read it. Eleanor kept her eyes on the beans. The silence stretched out long enough that she knew it wasn't a short letter. She's arriving Thursday, Thomas said. Thursday was 4 days away. What does she want? Eleanor asked. She says she wants to call on us. He folded the letter. She uses the word us. She wants to meet you. Eleanor turned from the stove. Why? She doesn't say directly. He set the letter on the table. But I've known Clara Whitmore a long time. She doesn't call on people. She makes assessments. She wants to see what she left you for. He looked up. Yes, that's probably accurate. Eleanor turned back to the beans. All right, she said. Eleanor, I said all right, Thomas. She's coming. We'll receive her. I'm not going to make this into something it doesn't have to be. A pause. You're not angry? I'm very angry, she said calmly. But being angry at a woman I've never met for making a decision years before I arrived is not a productive use of my energy. She stirred the pot. Being angry at the situation, on the other hand, is completely reasonable, and I intend to get through it quietly. Another pause. Longer. You're a remarkable woman, Thomas said. I'm a practical one, Eleanor said. There's a difference. But she kept her back to him until she was sure her face was doing what she needed it to do. The 4 days between the letter and Thursday had their own particular texture, a held-breath quality, a waiting room feeling that settled over the ranch like weather coming in. Thomas didn't talk about Clara again, but Eleanor felt the subject between them the way you feel a bruise you keep accidentally pressing. Present. Tender. Impossible to ignore entirely. She kept herself busy, which was her oldest and most reliable strategy for getting through things. She finished preserving the last of the summer garden. She mended everything in the house that needed mending. She spent an afternoon with Cal, the foreman, who was teaching her without being asked, without making a production of it, which parts of the ranch operation she needed to understand, and which she could leave alone. You don't have to do this, she told him one morning when he'd come to find her specifically to explain something about the water rotation for the cattle. I know, Cal said. Then why are you... He squinted at the middle distance. Because the boss runs this land and you run this house, and eventually those two things touch at the edges, and when they do, it goes better if you know what you're touching. He glanced at her. My wife figured that out in the first year. Saved us about 100 arguments. You're married. 32 years. Eleanor looked at him with something that might have been envy, if envy had been a feeling she'd ever allowed herself much of. How did you know, she said, that she was the one Cal thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated? She argued with me the first time we met, he said. Over a fence line, and she was right. I knew she was right while she was talking, and I still couldn't stop listening to her voice. He paused. I figured anyone whose voice I wanted to keep hearing, even when the words coming out of it were making me wrong, that was probably a good sign. Eleanor walked back to the house, thinking about that, for a long time. Clara Whitmore arrived on Thursday on the afternoon stage. Thomas went to meet her. Eleanor did not go with him. She had offered, and Thomas had looked at her for a long moment and said, "You don't have to." And she had understood that this was him giving her the choice, not him preferring she stay behind. There was a difference. She was getting better at reading those differences. She stayed behind. She changed into her best dress, which was not impressive by any objective measure, but was clean and pressed, and fit her well, and she put her hair up carefully, and she did not look at her reflection in the window longer than it took to confirm that her appearance was tidy. She heard the wagon an hour later. She was in the parlor when they came in. She had placed herself in the parlor, deliberately sitting with a book she wasn't reading, because the parlor was the room that said, "This house has someone living in it who belongs here," and she needed that message delivered without words. Thomas came through the front door first, and then Clara Whitmore walked in behind him. Eleanor understood in the first 2 seconds several things simultaneously. She understood why Thomas had loved this woman. Clara was beautiful in the specific way that was hard to argue with, tall, dark-haired, with a quality of arrangement about her as though she moved through spaces, knowing they would arrange themselves around her. She wore a traveling suit that spoke quietly and expensively of Denver. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had never once wondered if she deserved to take up space. She also understood in those same 2 seconds exactly what Clara was doing as her eyes moved around the room. Took in the parlor, took in Eleanor, took in Eleanor's face, with a pause so brief and so controlled that only someone who had spent a lifetime watching for it would have caught it, and then settled into the pleasant expression of a woman who had come for a social call. "Mrs. Reed," Clara said, "how lovely to meet you." Her voice was warm, genuinely warm. That was the thing Eleanor had expected: cold or barely concealed contempt, and gotten neither. What she got was something more sophisticated than either of those, and therefore more difficult to navigate. "Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor said. "Please sit down." Clara sat in the chair across from Eleanor's. Thomas stood near the doorway with the expression of a man who had ridden into a river and was only now calculating the current. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult," Eleanor said. "Not at all. I adore the stage, actually. You see such interesting country." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Thomas tells me you're from Ohio. Columbus." "Yes." "I've never been. I understand it's very green." "It is," Eleanor said. "Wyoming takes some adjusting to." "I imagine it does." Clara's eyes did their brief controlled circuit of the room. "You've made it feel very homey already. Thomas, she's done wonders in here," Thomas said. "Eleanor has good instincts." "Clearly." Clara smiled at Eleanor. "You must find the social aspects rather limited coming from a city. Silver Creek is very small." "I've found the people to be substantial," Eleanor said. "Size doesn't determine that." Something moved through Clara's expression. Something that was almost respect. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." She stayed for coffee and 2 hours. In those 2 hours, Eleanor learned that Clara Whitmore was intelligent, that she was genuinely charming when she wanted to be, and that she was doing exactly what Thomas had predicted, making an assessment. She asked questions that sounded conversational and weren't. She watched Thomas the way a woman watches a man she once owned, and has been trying to convince herself she doesn't still want. She watched Eleanor the way a woman watches an opponent she's trying to categorize. Eleanor answered the questions that deserved answers and redirected the ones that didn't, and she kept her voice even, and she refilled cups when they needed refilling, and she did not once touch her left cheek. When Clara finally rose to leave, she took Eleanor's hand in both of hers. "You're not what I expected," Clara said quietly, meaning it as something, though Eleanor wasn't entirely sure what. "People rarely are," Eleanor said. Clara looked at her for a moment, with something raw in her eyes. Just for a moment, just a flash. And then it was gone and the arrangement was back, and she turned to Thomas and said goodbye with the warmth of a woman who has decided something. Thomas walked her out to the wagon she'd hired. Eleanor stayed in the parlor. She heard the low exchange of voices outside, not the words, just the tone. Clara's voice asking something. Thomas's voice answering, brief, definitive. A pause. Clara's voice again lower. Thomas the same. Then the sound of a horse moving. Thomas came back in. He looked at her. "What did she say?" Eleanor asked. "She asked me if I was happy." "And what did you say?" He crossed the room and sat down in the chair Clara had just vacated, and looked at Eleanor with the directness that was she had come to understand simply how he communicated the things that mattered most to him. "I told her yes," he said. "I told her I was getting there." Eleanor breathed out slowly. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I thought you'd appreciate that." "I do." She set her cup down. "Thomas, she's not done." He didn't argue. "No. She came today to look. She'll come back with something to say." "Probably." "Are you going to be all right with that?" He looked at her, this long particular look of his, that she was learning to read the one that meant he was deciding how much of the interior of himself to let through. "Are you?" he said. "No," she said honestly, "but I'll manage." "That's the same answer I have," he said. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, and she pressed her lips together against it, and Thomas saw her do it, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when something pleased him that he didn't want to make a production of. "Good," he said. "Then we'll manage together." She came back on Saturday. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, and she looked out and saw Clara dismounting from a rented horse with the ease of a woman who'd grown up riding, and Eleanor set down what she was doing and dried her hands and went to the front door and opened it before Clara could knock. Clara stopped on the porch step. "I didn't think you'd be the one to answer," she said. "Thomas is in the north pasture," Eleanor said. "It'll be an hour before he's back." Clara looked at her. "I could come back." "Or you could come in," Eleanor said, "and say what you came to say to me instead of waiting to say it in front of him." The calculation behind Clara's eyes was visible and brief. She came in. Eleanor brought coffee she hadn't been asked for, set it on the table, and sat down. Clara sat across from her. They looked at each other. "You know why I came," Clara said. "Yes." "And you're not going to ask me to leave?" "No," Eleanor said, "because you're going to say it anyway, and I'd rather hear it in my kitchen than wonder about it for the next 3 months. Clara wrapped her hands around her cup. "You're very direct." "When it matters." A pause. Clara looked at her cup, then at Eleanor. Then she said, "He deserves better than what you can give him." The words landed. Eleanor let them land. She didn't flinch. She didn't deflect. She let the words sit in the room and breathe. "Better how?" she said. "He's a wealthy man. He's going to be an important man in this territory. The woman beside him—" Clara stopped, started again more carefully. "People will always wonder why he chose you. That kind of thing follows a man." "You mean my face," Eleanor said. "I mean, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor's voice was quiet. "I've spent 25 years listening to people say what you're saying right now in every possible way, kind, cruel, concerned, and in between. I know all the shapes of it. You can say the direct thing." Clara's jaw tightened. "Your appearance will always be a liability for him. Socially, politically. Men with ambition need—" "What do you want?" Eleanor said. Clara stopped. "What specifically do you want to happen here?" Eleanor said. "Because we can talk about Thomas's social position for another hour, or you can tell me what you actually want." Something cracked in Clara's composure. Just a line of fracture there, and then sealed again. "I made a mistake," Clara said. The kitchen was very quiet. 7 years ago," Clara said, "I made a mistake. And then I spent 7 years convincing myself I hadn't, and then I heard he'd married and I—" She stopped. Her hands tightened on the cup. "I came here to see if it was real." "And," Eleanor said. Clara looked at her. For the first time since she'd walked in, the arrangement was completely gone, and what Eleanor saw underneath it was a woman who was 31 years old and deeply, quietly unhappy, in a way she had probably been for a very long time. "It's real," Clara said. "That's what's making this difficult." Eleanor sat with that. She sat with the knowledge that the woman across from her was in pain, and that she couldn't fix it, and that she shouldn't fix it, and that the pain was not her responsibility to take on. And she sat with the other knowledge, the smaller one, that she understood what it felt like to look at something and realize it was permanent. To realize there was no going back. She understood that more than she wanted to. "You should go home, Miss Whitmore," she said, "not because I'm threatened by you, but because whatever you're looking for by being here, you're not going to find it." "Because he loves you." "Because he's chosen a life," Eleanor said. "And it's this one. And being here is going to keep you from finding yours." Clara looked at her for a long time. "You're not what I expected," she said again, and this time Eleanor heard what it actually meant, that Clara had come expecting someone she could dismiss and had found someone she couldn't. "I know," Eleanor said. Clara stood, straightened her jacket. All the arrangement came back into place with the smooth efficiency of long practice. "He's lucky," she said at the door. "He works very hard," Eleanor said. "So I'd say he's earned it." Clara almost smiled. Then she was gone. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a long moment after the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then she got up and went back to what she'd been doing. Her hands were completely steady. She noted that, filed it away, moved on. Thomas came in an hour later and found her where she was. The kitchen, always the kitchen, and she told him what had happened with the straightforward economy she'd learned was the only communication style he truly trusted. He listened without interrupting. He stood against the doorframe with his arms crossed the way he did when he was processing something he hadn't anticipated, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You told her to go home," he said. "I told her she should." "And she left?" "Yes." He uncrossed his arms, moved to the table, and sat. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "I was angry in the middle of it. I'm better now." "What were you angry about?" She looked at him. "She came into my house and told me I was a liability." "She did." Those were the polite words. Thomas's jaw set. "Thomas," Eleanor said, "I handled it." "I know you handled it. I'm still—" "She's not wrong," Eleanor said. "About the social mathematics of it. She's not wrong." "Eleanor." "I'm not looking for reassurance," she said. "I'm telling you a fact. I know what people see when they see us together. I knew before I got on the train. That's not new information." She paused. "What I told her is that you'd made a choice, and that you'd made a life, and that those were yours to keep." He looked at her. "Why?" he said quietly. She frowned. "Why what? Why defend a choice you're not sure you believe I made clearly?" The question hit her somewhere undefended. She felt it, the specific accuracy of it, in the way you feel a doctor press exactly the right place without warning. "Because it was the true thing," she said. "You did choose. Whatever it was based on, or not based on, you chose. And that deserved defending." He was quiet for a moment. "I need you to understand something," he said. "All right. When Clara left, when she told me she was leaving because of the injury, because I wasn't what she'd planned for." He paused. "I spent about 3 years after that believing she'd been right. That I'd become someone who had less to offer than he used to. That I'd been—" He stopped. Chose the word. "Diminished." She waited. "The letters I got from the women in Columbus, I read 43 of them. And they all wanted the same thing. They wanted the rancher in the advertisement, the profitable, spread the established man, the good income." He looked at her. "Your letter was the only one that asked about me." She frowned. "I asked practical questions." "You asked if I liked dogs." She blinked. "That's practical. A man who doesn't like dogs is usually—" "Eleanor." His voice was quiet. "You asked what I was afraid of." She remembered the letter now. She had written it at the kitchen table in her boarding house room at 11 o'clock at night, when she was too tired to self-edit, and she had asked exactly what she wanted to know, and assumed it would disqualify her. "You answered," she said. "Yes. You said you were afraid of becoming the kind of man who stopped trying." "Yes." She sat with that. "I'm still trying," he said. "In case that wasn't clear." She looked at him. This man who had built his life so carefully around everything he'd lost, that he'd forgotten to leave room for anything new. And she thought, he is trying. He is actually genuinely trying. And that was not nothing. In her experience, that was not a small thing at all. "I know," she said. "Does that matter to you?" The question was so careful, so exactly calibrated to the amount of vulnerability he could afford to show. She recognized that calibration because she used it herself constantly. "Yes," she said. "It matters." He nodded once. She looked back at the table. He reached across it and covered her hand with his just for a moment, just briefly. The way you'd steady something, you were afraid of startling, and then he pulled his hand back and stood up. "I'm going to wash up," he said. "What's for supper?" "Whatever I feel like making," she said. "Fair," he said, and left the kitchen. Eleanor looked at her hand on the table, the place where his had been. She turned it over, looked at the palm, the calluses from the laundry from years of work. She closed her fingers and opened them again, kept moving. Clara left Silver Creek the following Monday. Cal mentioned it casually at midday, the way he mentioned weather, and Eleanor filed it away and said, "Thank you for letting me know," and went back to what she was doing. But the departure did something she hadn't expected. It cleared the air. As though the thing she'd been bracing against had been standing just outside the window, and now that it had moved on, she could finally open the window again. She opened it. She started accepting the invitations that had been filtering in since her arrival. Small gatherings, church socials, the informal sort of visiting that held small towns together. She had been cautious about them, knowing that every new room she walked into would require her to stand through the initial assessment period, the moment of adjustment, the careful rearrangement of other people's faces. She stood through them, and something happened that she hadn't quite allowed herself to predict. The women of Silver Creek, taken one at a time in their kitchens and their parlors, turned out to be mostly just women, tired and capable and interested in things that mattered. They had opinions about the water rights situation that Thomas had told her about, sharper opinions than their husbands in some cases. And they had children who needed things, and households that required managing, and problems that were interesting to work on. Martha Howell from the general store turned out to be an extraordinarily competent preserver. She and Eleanor spent an afternoon together over a problem with a batch of tomatoes that had set wrong, and by the end of it, Martha had forgotten to do the thing with her eyes. A woman named Dora, whose husband was a neighboring rancher, came to Eleanor specifically because she'd heard Eleanor had worked in a factory and knew how to read contracts, and she wanted to understand the water rights papers her husband was considering signing. Eleanor read the papers, found the language, explained it in words Dora could take home, and explained to her husband. Dora's husband did not sign. Word got around. It always did. The shift was subtle, the way all real shifts are. Not a single moment of transformation, but a dozen small ones accumulating. A wave in town that was genuine rather than polite. A woman stopping her in the street to ask her opinion on something. Children at the church social who didn't notice her face because children were only interested in whether you paid attention to them, which Eleanor always did. She came home one evening from a visit to find Thomas on the porch, and he looked at her face and said, "Good day." Not a question. "A good day," she confirmed. He moved over on the porch steps, making room, and she sat beside him, and they looked at the land going gold in the last of the light. "Martha Howell asked me to help her with the church harvest supper," Eleanor said. "She's asked 3 women every year for the past 10 years, and somehow none of them are ever enough help," Thomas said. "I got that impression. I told her yes anyway." "Of course you did." She looked at him sideways. "Was that wrong?" "No, it was exactly right." He looked out at the land. "You know people are talking about you." "People are always talking about me. Differently now," he said. "Dora Prescott's husband came to find me last week. Said you'd raid their water contract and flagged something the attorney in Cheyenne hadn't caught." Eleanor blinked. The Cheyenne attorney had read it. "Apparently, Prescott says you were faster and more specific." She was quiet for a moment. "I just read what was there." "That's the thing about reading carefully," Thomas said. "Not everyone does it." She looked at her hands. "Thomas, the water rights the company that's been buying them. How many ranches have signed 7 at last count? And the language in the contracts, it's the same across all of them, near as I can tell. If it's the same language across all of them, that means it was drafted by the same attorney. Which means there's a coordinated strategy." She paused. "Who is the company? What's their registered name?" He looked at her. Western Territorial Water and Land Associates. Who owns it? That's what my attorney in Cheyenne is trying to find out. The registration is through a holding company in Chicago. She turned to look at him fully. Thomas, that's not a legitimate land and water company. That's a paper structure designed to hide who's actually holding the assets. He was looking at her with the expression he got when something she said was more than he'd expected. How do you know that? He said. I told you. I learned to read contracts when the factory changed our piece rate terms. And then I helped 3 other women in my building understand their rental agreements. And then a woman I knew asked me to look at a business arrangement her brother was entering into. She paused. The structure you're describing, the offshore holding company, the identical contract language, that's not commerce. That's a legal mechanism. For what? For eventually owning the water in this entire region, she said. Once they have enough ranches locked into those drought year provisions, they control the water. And when the drought comes, and it always comes, they control whether these ranches survive or not. Thomas was very still. That's what I was afraid of, he said quietly. You already knew this. I suspected it. You just gave it a shape I can take to an attorney. She looked back out at the land. Then take it. And take it fast. Because if they're already at 7 ranches, and nobody has stopped to look at the pattern, they're going to be at 15 before anyone realizes what's happened. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know you're becoming essential. She looked at him. To this ranch, he added. And then more quietly, to me. She felt it, that dangerous specific warmth that she had been very careful about not feeling too directly, because hope was the feeling that had always cost her most. I'm becoming useful, she said carefully. No, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those eyes that had been deepening since the first day, that had some quality in them she still hadn't named, perfectly steadiness maybe. The particular steadiness of a man who had been through the thing that breaks most people and had chosen to remain. Eleanor, he said. Thomas. I'd like to hold your hand. It was the most careful, deliberate Thomas Reed thing she had ever heard him say. She turned her hand over on the porch step between them. He covered it with his. They sat like that while the light finished going down, and the first stars found their places in the Wyoming sky, and Eleanor Hayes thought, this is the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to me. And then she thought, good. She should have known that the quiet wouldn't hold. It never did not. When something was being built, there was always the moment before the storm, and Eleanor had been around enough weather to know the feeling of a sky gathering itself. It came on a Wednesday in the 3rd month. Thomas came in from town with a face that was carefully arranged in a way she'd learned to read as bad news being managed. Sit down, she said. He sat. What happened? He put a folded paper on the table. The attorney in Cheyenne got further than he expected into the holding company structure. She looked at the paper. And? Western Territorial Water and Land Associates is owned at the 2nd level of the holding structure by a company called Whitmore Capital. The name dropped into the kitchen like a stone into still water. Eleanor looked up slowly. Clara's family, she said. Her father's company, Thomas said. Yes, the silence was very specific. She knew, Eleanor said. When she came here, she already knew. I don't know that for certain. Thomas. She looked at him. She came here the week after this company had already gotten 4 ranches to sign. She spent 2 hours in this house looking at everything. She asked you about the northern pasture specifically. Do you remember? He did remember. She could see it. She asked how the water access worked on the north side, he said slowly, because that's the most important water access on this land. Eleanor's voice was steady. She was past the anger stage and into the cold clarity stage, which was where she did her best thinking. She wasn't here to assess me, Thomas, or not only that, she was here to assess this ranch. Eleanor. I'm not upset, she said. I'm thinking. Let me think. He waited. If her father's company owns the structure, she said, that doesn't necessarily mean she knew. Wealthy daughters aren't always told what their fathers are doing with money. She paused. But she came here. She asked about the water. And she left 2 days later. I know. Which means either she was gathering information for her father. She paused. Or she was gathering information for herself and didn't realize her father was the reason she should care. Thomas leaned forward and put his hands flat on the table. Does the distinction matter right now? It matters for what we do next, Eleanor said. If she knew and was acting for her father, we have an adversary who's been inside this house. If she didn't know, if she finds out, she might be the only person who can give us access to the holding company's internal documentation. Thomas stared at her. You're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, she said. I'm mapping the landscape. He was quiet for a long moment. Where did you learn to do this? He said. She looked at him. Do what? Think like this. In the middle of something this close to home, think this clearly. She looked down at the paper on the table. From necessity, she said. When you've spent your life being underestimated, you learn to see clearly, because clear is the only advantage you have. He reached across the table, not for her hand this time. He covered the paper with his hand, and then he looked at her and he said, I need you on this. She met his eyes. I know. I mean it. Not as my wife, as a... He paused, finding the word. As a partner. Eleanor Hayes, who had arrived in Silver Creek 3 months ago, believing she was a mistake, looked at the man across the table, who was asking her specifically, deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was asking, to stand beside him in something that mattered. All right, she said. All right. Stop looking surprised, she said. I said all right. Let's start with what the attorney found and work from there. Thomas pulled his chair around to her side of the table. They bent over the papers together. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north. Neither of them noticed. The papers spread across the kitchen table told a story that the people of Silver Creek had been living inside without knowing it. Eleanor had been at it for 2 hours by the time Thomas came back from the barn, and she had 3 pages of notes in her own handwriting. Compact, precise, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to get a lot onto a small piece of paper. Tell me, he said without preamble. She pointed at the first document. The holding structure has 4 layers. Whitmore Capital at the top. Then a company called Rocky Mountain Land Trust registered in Missouri. Then Western Territorial Water Associates, which is the entity that actually holds the contracts. And then the individual agreements with each rancher. 4 layers. 4 layers means 4 opportunities to confuse a judge or an attorney about who's actually responsible for what. It's not complicated finance, it's deliberate obscurity. She tapped the 3rd page. But here's what they didn't count on. Every one of those contracts was notarized by the same man, a notary in Laramie named Edson Croft. Thomas pulled the papers toward him. 1 notary across 7 contracts in 3 counties, which means Croft either traveled to each rancher specifically or the ranchers were brought to him. Either way, he's the thread that connects all of it, and a notary keeps records. Thomas looked at her steadily. The attorney in Cheyenne needs to know this. Tonight, if possible, Eleanor said. Because if whoever is behind this realizes that the holding structure has been traced, those records disappear. Things have a way of disappearing when powerful people need them to. He was already standing. I'll ride to the telegraph office. Thomas? He stopped. If it is Whitmore behind this Clara's father, he has resources we don't have. Political connections. He'll know before we expect him to that someone is pulling the thread. What are you saying? I'm saying move fast and trust very few people, she said. Cal, your attorney. Nobody else until we know what we have. He looked at her for a moment. That particular look she'd come to understand meant he was seeing her clearly rather than through the image he'd constructed. You've done this before, he said. Not contracts, but this navigating something where the power is against you. Every day of my life, she said simply. He left for the telegraph office. Eleanor sat alone at the table with the papers and the lamp, and the particular silence of a house that is waiting. The attorney's name was Harlan Webb, and he arrived from Cheyenne 4 days later, looking like a man who had not slept on the stage because he'd been reading and hadn't wanted to stop. He was maybe 50, thin with the kind of face that had been everywhere and retained the memory of all of it. He shook Thomas's hand and then looked at Eleanor and said, "You're the one who found the notary thread." "Yes." "Good eye." He sat at the kitchen table and opened his case. "I have more." What Webb had was a deposition from a rancher in Fremont County named August Selby, who had signed one of the contracts 6 months ago and had been trying to get out of it ever since. Selby had met with the company's representative twice before signing, and he remembered the man's name, a man called Hargrove, who had described himself as a Denver land investor. "Hargrove," Thomas said. "You know the name?" Webb asked. "He was in Silver Creek 3 months before Eleanor arrived, spoke to 2 ranchers here. Neither of them signed, but I heard his pitch secondhand." Thomas paused. He told Dawson over at the Creek Fork Ranch that the drought years were coming and that any man who didn't protect his water access now was going to regret it. "Which is technically true," Eleanor said. "It's just that the protection he was selling was a trap." Webb looked at her again. "Mrs. Reed, can I ask what your background is?" "I worked in a laundry in Columbus for 3 years. Before that, I helped my father with his accounts until he died." "Your father was in business." "He ran a small mill, until a creditor used a contract provision he hadn't read to call in a loan early and take the property." She paused. "I was 14. I read the contract after. I understood what had happened." Webb was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, but it's why I read carefully." Thomas had gone still, in the way he went still, when he was taking in information he hadn't had before and filing it in the appropriate place. She could feel his attention on her without looking at him. She didn't look at him. "What do we have that can actually help the ranchers who've already signed?" she asked Webb. "The drought provision language is arguably unconscionable under territorial contract law," Webb said. "But that's a court argument, and courts take time. What would move faster is if we can prove the contracts were entered into under misrepresentation, that Hargrove or any company representative made material misstatements to the ranchers about what they were signing." "Selby's deposition," is one voice. "We need more." Eleanor looked at Thomas. "The other 6 ranchers who signed. Can you get to them?" "3 of them I know personally," Thomas said. "Prescott, I can call on today. Dawson, Emery Fitch out on the East Range." "If each of them met with Hargrove and each of them heard the same pitch, then we have a pattern of misrepresentation," Webb said, leaning forward. "Yes, that's exactly right." "Get to them before Hargrove does," Eleanor said. "If he hears someone is collecting statements, he'll get there first and find a way to change their memory of the conversation." Webb looked at Thomas. "Your wife is right. This week, not next." Thomas stood up. "I'll ride today." He came back that evening with Prescott and Dawson both. Eleanor made coffee for 4 and put food on the table because she'd learned that men talked more easily about hard things when their hands had something to do, and then she sat and listened while Thomas laid out what they had found. Prescott was a large, quiet man who looked at everything slowly before responding. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then he said, "I met with Hargrove twice. He told me the drought clause was standard in all Western water agreements." "It's not standard," Eleanor said. Prescott looked at her. "You're sure?" "I read 11 different water agreements from the territorial records over the past 3 days," she said. "None of them have that language." Dawson, who was younger and quicker to anger, slapped his palm on the table. "He lied to me straight to my face. I asked him specifically if there were any circumstances where the company could limit my water access, and he said no." "Did he say that before or after you signed?" Eleanor asked. "Before, when I asked about the contract terms." "You remember exactly. My wife was standing right there. She'll say the same." Eleanor looked at Webb. Webb was already writing. That's misrepresentation, Webb said. If Mrs. Dawson confirms it, we have 2 witnesses to a verbal misstatement made at the point of contract. That's actionable. Who are we actioning against? Prescott said. The company. The company, and potentially the individuals behind it, depending on what we can prove about the holding structure. Webb looked at Thomas. The Whitmore connection, I have to be careful how I move on that. Edmund Whitmore has attorneys in 3 territories and a federal judge in his social circle. What does that mean for us? Dawson said. It means we build the case from the bottom up, Eleanor said. We prove the contracts are fraudulent. We prove misrepresentation. We go to the territorial court with clean documented evidence that can't be argued away by expensive lawyers. And then we let the holding structure become someone else's problem, the courts or a federal investigator's. Prescott was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Thomas, Prescott said, without looking away from Eleanor. Where did you find her? Ohio, Thomas said. She found me. They worked for 2 weeks. Eleanor had not known that 2 weeks could contain so many different kinds of exhaustion. The physical kind, from being up late and up early from riding to neighboring ranches with Thomas, to collect statements from writing and rewriting summaries for Webb that were clear enough to survive a courtroom. And the other kind, the one that came from sustained attention from holding a lot of information in order and not losing any of it. She didn't mind either kind. She had always been a woman who needed something real to work on. Thomas noticed. He noticed the way he noticed everything quietly without announcement. He brought her coffee when she was deep in documents. He took over the kitchen tasks without being asked during the 3 days when she was most buried. He came in one evening and looked at the papers on the table and at Eleanor's face and said, "When did you last sleep a full night?" "Define full," she said. Eleanor. "I'm fine. You're also not fine, and I'd like you to stop for tonight." She looked up at him. "Thomas, the Fitch statement needs to be organized before Webb gets here Thursday." "It will still need organizing Friday morning," he said. "Come to the porch. The night's cool." She opened her mouth. "Please," he said. She closed her mouth, put down her pen, followed him to the porch. They sat in the dark and the cool of it, and Eleanor let her mind do the thing it needed to do. Unspool, slightly release its grip on the threads it had been holding so tightly. The stars were out. Wyoming stars were still something she hadn't gotten used to, the sheer volume of them, the way they changed the scale of everything underneath. "My father," Thomas said out of nowhere. She looked at him. "He built this ranch from 40 acres, Thomas said. Came out here from Pennsylvania with my mother and a wagon and $20. He had nothing except that he knew cattle, and he wasn't afraid of work." He paused. "He spent 30 years building something. And then the year before he died, a land broker out of Cheyenne tried to use a grazing rights dispute to get him to sell the northern acreage for half what it was worth. What did he do? He fought it. Took 3 years. Nearly broke him." Another pause. "He won, but it cost him in ways that didn't show up in the court record." He looked at the stars. "That's why this what Whitmore's people are doing. That's why it's not only business to me." "I know," Eleanor said. "I don't think I told you that." "You didn't need to." She looked at him. "Thomas, we're going to win this." He glanced at her. "You sound certain." "I am certain. We have clean evidence, honest witnesses, and an attorney who knows what he's doing. What they have is a complicated structure designed to confuse. Complicated structures fall apart faster than simple truths." She paused. "Simple truths are harder to argue with." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that how you get through it?" he said. "The simple truth." She frowned slightly. "Get through what? What people do to you. What they've always done." He was looking at her directly. "You lead with the simple truth about yourself, and you let other people deal with their own complications." She considered that. "I suppose I do. I never thought about it that way. It's effective." "It's survival," she said. "Effective came later." He nodded slowly. Eleanor. Yes. When this is done, when the case is filed and Webb is handling the legal part, I want to take you somewhere. She looked at him. Where? Somewhere I've been meaning to show you since you got here. There's a place on the North Range where you can see 4 different mountain peaks. You have to ride about 2 hours to get there. He paused. It's the most beautiful place I've ever been. I've never shown it to anyone. She held that information carefully. Why me? She said. Because it took me 37 years to find something worth showing it to someone, he said. And now I have. She looked back at the stars. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. All right, she said finally. When this is done. When this is done, he agreed. The trouble arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days before Webb was scheduled to file in territorial court. It came in the form of a man named Gerald Crane, well-dressed, polite in the manner of men who use politeness as a tool, who arrived at the ranch without prior notice and asked to speak with Thomas Reed. Eleanor was in the yard when he rode up, and she looked at him and felt the immediate specific unease of recognizing a type. She had met Gerald Crane before, or men exactly like him, the kind of man who came to your door with a pleasant expression and a position of power and said things that sounded reasonable and meant the opposite. Mr. Reed, she called toward the barn. Someone here to see you. Thomas came out, looked at the man, looked at Eleanor's face, and understood from it that he should be careful. Thomas Reed, Crane said, stepping forward with his hand extended. Gerald Crane. I represent Western Territorial Water and Land Associates. Thomas shook the hand without any change in expression. I know who you represent. Crane's pleasant expression didn't waver. Then you know why I'm here. There seems to have been some concern in the region about our company's contracts. I'm here to clear up any misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Thomas said. We've read the contracts carefully. Then you understand they're entirely standard. My wife showed me 11 other water agreements from the territorial records, Thomas said. The drought provision in yours isn't in any of them. Crane's eyes moved to Eleanor. His pleasant expression made its small practiced adjustment. Mrs. Reed, he said, I understand you've been involved in reviewing these documents. Yes, she said. That's admirable. I do think there may be some aspects of water law that are a bit technical. Mr. Crane, Eleanor said, I read the notary records for all 7 contracts. Edson Croft notarized every one of them. His log should show the dates and circumstances of each signing. Does Mr. Croft know his records have been requested by an attorney in Cheyenne? The pleasant expression finally did something real. It didn't disappear. Men like Crane didn't let it disappear, but it reset. Like a card player who has just realized the other side of the table can see his hand. I'm not aware of any such request, Crane said carefully. You will be, Eleanor said. Probably tomorrow. A pause that was not long but was very full. Mr. Reed, Crane said, turning back to Thomas with a recalibrated approach. My company is prepared to offer amended terms. We understand some ranchers have concerns, and we're willing to discuss modifications to the drought provision language. Are you willing to void the existing contracts? Thomas said. That's not... Because that's the outcome we're working toward, Thomas said. If your company wants to avoid what's coming in territorial court, voiding the contracts and making the ranchers whole is the shortest path. Mr. Reed, I don't think you understand the resources. I understand them clearly, Thomas said. So does our attorney. So does my wife. He looked at Crane without expression. You've had your visit. I think we're done here. Crane looked between Thomas and Eleanor. He smiled one more time, the smile of a man filing information away for later use. I hope we can resolve this without unpleasantness, he said. Unpleasantness, Thomas said, is generally the other side's choice. Good day, Mr. Crane. Crane rode out. Eleanor and Thomas stood in the yard and watched him go. He's going to report back tonight, Eleanor said. And tomorrow, someone is going to move to limit what the notary can share. I know. Thomas was already turning toward the house. I need to get a message to Webb. Already writing it, she said, and went inside ahead of him. Webb received the message and moved faster than Eleanor had thought an attorney could move. By Saturday, he had a court order preserving Croft's notary records. By Monday, he had Croft's testimony in hand, and what Croft told him changed the shape of everything. Croft was a small man who had spent 20 years doing routine notary work in Laramie and had been paid by his own account 3 times his standard fee for each of the 7 contract signings. He had been told this was because the signings were time-sensitive and required travel. He had not been told anything else. But he had kept records, meticulous records, the records of a man whose entire professional identity was built on documentation, and those records showed something that no amount of holding company structure could obscure. Each rancher had been brought to Croft's office individually. Each signing had taken place within 2 days of a specific event, a report published in a Denver financial paper projecting serious drought conditions in the Wyoming Territory within the next 3 years. Crane's men had been timing the signings to periods of maximum rancher anxiety. They were manufacturing urgency, Eleanor said when Webb laid this out at the kitchen table. Reading the drought reports and then targeting ranchers right after. It's not illegal to time a business approach, Webb said. But it's additional evidence of intent. It shows they knew the drought provision was the key lever, and they were using anxiety to get signatures before anyone looked closely. Can we use Croft's records in court? Thomas asked. They're now court-preserved. Yes. Eleanor sat back. Webb, who told Crane that Croft's records had been requested? He knew when he came here. He used the word request before I said anything specific. Webb was quiet for a moment. Someone in the Cheyenne courthouse. Which means they have visibility into the territorial court system. Whitmore's connections, Thomas said. Yes. Webb folded his hands on the table. Which means we can't file in territorial court. The kitchen went still. Where then? Thomas said. Federal Land Commission, Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. Water rights in the territory affect federal land interests, she said. If the company is acquiring water control over land that includes federal grazing allotments, and at least 2 of the signed ranches have federal allotments. I saw them in the contract annexes. Then this falls under federal jurisdiction as well as territorial. Webb was staring at her. Mrs. Reed, the Federal Land Commission has different oversight. Whitmore's connections at the territorial court level don't reach there the same way. That's correct, Webb said slowly. That's correct, and I should have. He stopped, shook his head. I've been so focused on the territorial approach, I didn't consider the federal angle. You're the attorney, Eleanor said. Can we do it? The Federal Land Commission in this district convenes in 8 weeks. If I have the full case ready. He was already calculating. It's possible. It's aggressive, but it's possible. 8 weeks, Thomas said. I know it's fast. Then let's not waste any of it, Thomas said, and looked at Eleanor, and she nodded, and that was that. 6 weeks into the 8 was when Clara Whitmore came back. Eleanor was alone at the house Thomas had ridden to the Fitch Ranch with Webb to collect the final statement when she heard the horse, and she looked out and felt the particular tiredness of a woman who has already navigated this specific complication once and was not enthusiastic about doing it again. She went to the door and opened it before Clara dismounted. Clara looked up at her. She looked different from the last time, less arranged. Her hair was still neat, her clothes still expensive, but there was something in her face that had changed. Some of the careful architecture had come down or been knocked down, which were 2 different things, and Eleanor couldn't yet tell which had happened. He's not here, Eleanor said. I know, Clara said. I came to see you. Eleanor stepped back from the door. Clara came in and sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which was either presumption or exhaustion, and Eleanor looked at her face and decided it was the latter. What happened? Eleanor said. My father called me to Denver last week, Clara said. Eleanor sat down. He told me that someone was building a legal case against his company, that someone had found the holding structure. Clara looked at her hands on the table. He asked me if I had said anything to anyone about the company's interests in the Wyoming water contracts when I was here in Silver Creek. The kitchen was very quiet. What did you tell him? Eleanor said. I told him I hadn't said anything, because I hadn't. Clara looked up. Mrs. Reed, I didn't know. About the company. About what my father's money was doing out here. I knew he had investments in the territory. He always has investments. I didn't know. Her voice broke slightly at the edges. Held. I didn't know it was this. Eleanor looked at her steadily. When you were here. When you asked Thomas about the northern water access. My father asked me to look at the property, Clara said. He said he was thinking about making Thomas an offer on some land rights. He didn't tell me what kind. He said to just get a general sense of the water situation. And you did. And I did. Clara closed her eyes briefly. I didn't ask enough questions. That's what I did. I didn't ask enough questions because I was so wrapped up in what I came here for that I didn't. She stopped. I was using you. Both of you. Even if I didn't know exactly what for. The silence between them was different from the last time. Less adversarial. More honest, which somehow made it heavier. What do you want, Miss Whitmore? Eleanor said. Clara. I want to know what I can do. She looked at Eleanor directly. I know what my father is. I've spent 10 years knowing and not saying anything because he's my father, and it was easier. And then I came here and I saw. She stopped again. What did you see? Eleanor said quietly. Clara looked around the kitchen, at the papers on the table, at the organized shelves, at the small signs everywhere of a household that was being actively, purposefully inhabited by two people who had decided to build something together. I saw what I cost him, she said. 7 years ago. I saw what I cost him, and I saw what he built anyway, and I saw what you're doing to help him keep it. She looked at Eleanor. And I want to know what I can do. Eleanor sat with this. Your father's company, she said carefully. The internal documentation, the communication between Hargrove and your father's office about the timing of the contract signings. Would you have access to any of that? Clara's expression shifted. You want his records. The court needs his records, or enough of them to establish that the fraud was directed from the top of the company. Without that, the case removes the contracts, but your father walks away and does the same thing somewhere else. If I give you anything from his company, you'd be a witness, Eleanor said. At a federal hearing, with everything that means. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Eleanor began to calculate the alternative paths, the case, without Whitmore's internal documentation, the longer road, the less certain outcome. Then Clara said, he sent Hargrove to Silver Creek specifically because he knew Thomas owned the most strategically important water access in this part of the territory. He told me that. Not the fraud part, but the strategy. He said Thomas was the key holding. Eleanor kept very still. He said Thomas was the key holding, she repeated. He said if he could get Reed Ranch's water access under contract, the other ranches would follow because everyone in the region looks to Thomas for how to handle land decisions. Clara's voice was flat with the specific flatness of betrayal. He was planning to use Thomas's reputation to legitimize his own scheme. Eleanor stood up and went to the sideboard where Thomas kept a spare paper and pen, and she brought both back to the table and set them in front of Clara. Write that down, she said. Exactly what he said. When he said it. Where you were. Clara looked at the paper. Then she picked up the pen. Thomas came home to find two women sitting at his kitchen table writing. He stopped in the doorway. Eleanor looked up. Close the door, she said. We have something. He came in, looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with an expression that had the specific weight of an apology that had been a long time forming. Thomas, Clara said. Clara. I'm sorry, she said. For more than one thing, but right now specifically for this. He looked at Eleanor. Her father targeted you deliberately, Eleanor said. You were the centerpiece of the scheme. She's prepared to testify to conversations that establish her father's intent. Something moved across Thomas's face. Surprise, then the rapid processing that followed surprise, then the settling that came after. "Clara," he said slowly, "if you testify against your father—" "I know what it means," Clara said. "Your family. I know Thomas." She set the pen down. "But I spent 10 years looking the other way. And I came here, and I met your wife, and I saw what looking the other way had cost everyone." A pause. "I'm done looking the other way." Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "Tell me what you have," he said. Eleanor took the pages Clara had written, straightened them, and began to read aloud. Outside, the wind had picked up. Inside, 3 people sat around a kitchen table in Wyoming, and the shape of what was coming, what was actually coming, not the version any of them had imagined when this started, began to clarify itself. It was larger than Eleanor had calculated, harder than Thomas had prepared for, more costly in ways that hadn't been counted yet than anyone at the table fully understood. But it was real. And real, Eleanor had learned, was always better than the alternative. She kept reading. Webb left for Cheyenne the next morning with Clara's written statement in his case and a list of 7 additional items he needed before the federal commission hearing. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the wagon until she couldn't see it anymore. And then she went back inside and looked at the kitchen table, which still had the ring marks from 4 coffee cups and the indentations in the paper where Clara had pressed the pen too hard in certain places, and she thought, "This is either the thing that saves it or the thing that breaks it. There is no middle ground anymore." Thomas came in behind her. "She'll go back to Denver," he said. "Once she gives the statement, she'll have to face him." "I know. Are you worried about her?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I'm worried she'll change her mind before the hearing. Not because she's weak, because what she's agreeing to is genuinely hard, and hard things look different at 3 in the morning than they do at a kitchen table. Webb will keep the statement regardless." "A signed statement is not the same as a live witness," Eleanor said. "Her father's attorneys will argue it was obtained under emotional duress. They'll say she didn't understand what she was signing." She paused. "Clara needs to walk into that hearing room herself." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You like her," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." Eleanor turned to look at him. "I respect her. That's different." "Is it?" "Yes, liking someone is easy. Respecting them costs something." She turned back to the table and began gathering the papers. "I respect what she decided to do. I hope she can hold it. And if she can't, then we fight with what we have without her." Eleanor stacked the papers neatly. "We were always going to have to fight with what we have. Clara's testimony makes the case stronger. It doesn't make the case." Thomas put his hand flat on the stack of papers before she could move them. She looked up. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to say something." "All right." "When I found out my name was the centerpiece of their scheme, that they specifically targeted this ranch, my reputation, I wanted to be the one to handle it. To ride to Denver and confront Whitmore directly and settle it the way things used to get settled out here." She waited. "And then I sat at this table, and I watched you read Clara's statement aloud, and I understood that the way I wanted to handle it would have destroyed everything we've built instead of protecting it." He looked at her steadily. "You kept me from making the wrong move. You've been doing that since you got here." She held his gaze. "You kept yourself from making the wrong move. I just gave you a better option." "That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed. "But it's not the same as credit." He shook his head slowly. "You won't take it, will you? Any of it?" "I'll take what's accurate," she said. "We built this together. That's accurate." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. "Together." The week before the federal commission hearing was the longest week Eleanor could remember. Not because nothing was happening. Everything was happening. Webb sending daily telegrams, ranchers coming and going from the property to sign final statements. Cal coordinating the ranch operations so Thomas could focus on the case. But because all of it was moving toward a single fixed point that they could see but not yet reach, and the waiting had its own particular weight. On Tuesday, a telegram arrived from Denver. Thomas read it at the table and handed it to Eleanor without a word. It was from Clara. 4 lines. Father knows I spoke with Webb. He has retained Alderman and Cross. A pause in the message, the kind that came from the space between telegraph lines. I am not changing my testimony. Coming to Cheyenne Thursday. Eleanor set the telegram down. Alderman and Cross, Thomas said. I don't know the firm. Webb will. Thomas went to the telegraph office. Came back an hour later with an expression that she read immediately and accurately. Tell me, she said. Alderman and Cross are the most aggressive contract defense firm in the territory, he said. Webb says they've overturned 3 federal commission decisions in the last 5 years. They specialize in what he called, Thomas checked the telegram, procedural displacement. Which means what? They find technical problems with how the case was built and use them to get it dismissed before the evidence is heard. She absorbed this. What technical problems do we have? Webb says our case is clean. But clean and untouchable are different things. He sat down. They're going to look at every signature, every date, every piece of testimony, and find anything they can use. Then Webb needs to go through everything again before Thursday. She was already standing. I'll wire him. He needs to do a full procedural review tonight. Eleanor. Tonight, she said. Not tomorrow. Tonight, while there's still time to fix anything that needs fixing. She was at the door. You haven't eaten since this morning, Thomas said. She stopped. I'll eat after I send the wire. You'll eat before, he said. 10 minutes. Sit down. She turned around. Looked at him. He had bread and cheese on the table already, which meant he'd thought about this before she'd come in from the yard, which meant he'd been watching and planning for her the same way she'd been watching and planning for him. And that specific realization hit her somewhere she hadn't been ready for it. She sat down. She ate. Thank you, she said when she'd finished. Don't thank me for feeding you, he said. That shouldn't require gratitude. In my experience, I know what your experience is, he said quietly. We're building different experience now. She looked at him across the table. At this man who had said 4 words to her on a dusty street 5 months ago and had meant every one of them and had been proving it quietly in all the ways that couldn't be faked. Yes, she said. We are. Webb's procedural review found one problem. It wasn't large. It was the kind of thing that would only matter if the opposing attorneys were specifically looking for it. Which Alderman and Cross absolutely would be the date. On Prescott's initial statement didn't match the date in the covering letter Webb had filed with the commission. A clerical error, 2 digits transposed. 2 digits, small, fixable, but fixable only if caught before the hearing, and it had been caught Wednesday evening 11 hours before the commission convened. The telegram from Webb arrived at 9 at night. Thomas read it. He can file an amended submission in the morning, but the commission opens at 8 and the clerk's office opens at 7:30. How long does the amendment take to file? Webb says 20 minutes to prepare 10 to file. He needs to be at the clerk's office the moment it opens. Is he in Cheyenne now? He arrived this afternoon. Then it's manageable, Eleanor said. If nothing else goes wrong tonight. Nothing else went wrong that night. But what went wrong the next morning was something none of them had anticipated. Eleanor and Thomas arrived in Cheyenne on the first stage Wednesday morning, which got them there by 6:30. Webb met them at the hotel he'd been up since 4, he said, and looked it. And they went over everything one final time at a table in the hotel dining room, while the kitchen rattled to life around them. Alderman and Cross will lead with the jurisdictional argument, Webb said. They'll say the contracts are purely territorial in nature and the federal commission has no standing. The federal grazing allotments, Eleanor said. I'm ready for it. 2 of the 7 ranches have active federal allotments that would be directly affected by the drought provision. The commission has clear standing. He shuffled papers. They'll move to the misrepresentation argument next. They'll say Hargrove's statements were general sales representations, not material facts. But we have Dawson and his wife both stating the same specific language, Thomas said. Yes, And we have Croft's records showing the timing pattern. I'm going to walk the commission through the drought report dates and the signing dates side by side. The pattern is undeniable." Webb looked at them both. Clara's testimony is the capstone. If she holds, if she walks in there and says clearly what she told us, it establishes that the misrepresentation was directed and intentional, not incidental. That's the difference between a contract dispute and a fraud case. "Have you spoken to her this morning?" Eleanor asked. "I sent a message to her hotel at 6. No answer yet." The three of them looked at each other. "She'll be there," Eleanor said. She said it with more certainty than she had. Jade. The Federal Land Commission met in a building that smelled of old paper and institutional authority, in a room with 5 commissioners seated at an elevated bench and a gallery that was, to Eleanor's surprise, nearly full. Word had traveled. The ranchers from the affected properties were there, 8 of them, sitting together with the particular solidarity of men who have discovered they've been played for fools and are still deciding how angry to be about it. Prescott was there. Dawson with his wife. Fitch. Others she recognized from the weeks of statement collection. The company was represented by 2 men from Alderman and Cross. Efficient, expensive-looking men who had the relaxed confidence of people who win regularly and expected to today. Edmund Whitmore himself was not present. Eleanor noted that. Crane was there sitting behind the Alderman and Cross attorneys, watching the room with the careful eyes of a man who has been in rooms like this before and knows which details matter. He saw Eleanor. His expression didn't change, but his attention did a slight sharpening, a recalibration. She looked back at him steadily until he was the one who looked away. Thomas put his hand briefly at the small of her back. Just for a moment. Just to say, "I see it too." Webb sat up at the plaintiff's table. Thomas and Eleanor sat behind him. The commission chair called the hearing to order, and then the door opened. Clara Whitmore walked in. She was alone, no attorney, no companion, no armor of arrangement. She was wearing a dark blue dress, and her hair was simply done, and she walked to the front of the gallery and sat down and looked at the commissioners with the expression of a woman who has made a decision she intends to keep. Crane went rigid. Eleanor felt Thomas breathe out beside her. Webb stood up and said, "The plaintiffs call their first witness." The hearing took 4 hours. Webb was methodical and exact. He walked the commission through the evidence in the order he'd designed, the contract language, the drought report dates, the signing dates, Croft's notary records, the rancher's testimony about what they'd been told by Hargrove, and built it the way you build anything solid, one thing at a time, each piece supporting the next. Alderman and Cross challenged at every point. The jurisdictional argument first precisely as Webb had predicted. The commission took 12 minutes to confer and reject it. Then, the misrepresentation argument they called Hargrove's statements. General inducements, not material facts. Webb read the Dawson testimony verbatim, both Marcus Dawson and his wife, in perfect alignment about the specific words used. The alderman attorney, pivoted, tried to suggest the Dawsons had coordinated their recollection. The commission chair asked the attorney if he was alleging perjury. The attorney said no. The chair moved on. Eleanor sat behind the bar and watched, and stayed completely still. Which was what she did when she needed to be useful, and the only useful thing in this moment was not to interrupt. 2 hours in. Webb called Clara. She walked to the chair set at the side of the room for witnesses, and sat down, and the entire gallery went slightly quiet. Webb asked her to state her name and her relationship to the defendant company. She did. He asked her about her father's company and its operations. She answered clearly without hedging in the specific language of a woman who has decided that the time for careful omission is over. He asked her what her father had told her about Thomas Reed's ranch specifically. She said, "He told me that Thomas Reed was the key holding. That if he could secure Reed Ranch's water access, the other ranchers in the region would follow, because people out here make their decisions based on what Thomas does." She paused. He said Thomas's reputation was the asset he was actually buying. The gallery was very quiet. "And did he indicate?" Webb said, that the ranchers would be made aware of how the drought provision would function in practice. No, Clara said. He said, she paused. He said the language was designed to be clear to an attorney and opaque to a working rancher. One of the alderman attorneys was on his feet. Objection. The witness is characterizing her father's intent. I'm reporting what he said to me directly, Clara said without looking at the attorney. In his office, in Denver, 3 weeks ago. The commission chair looked at the alderman attorney. Overruled. Continue. Webb asked 3 more questions. Clara answered all 3. When he sat down, the alderman attorney stood and spent 20 minutes trying to establish that Clara's testimony was motivated by personal animus toward her father. Clara said, I love my father. That's why I'm here. Because he needs someone to stop him before this becomes something worse than a fraud case. That answer went through the room like weather. The alderman attorney sat down. The commission recessed for 40 minutes. In the hallway outside, Eleanor stood against the wall, and Thomas stood beside her, and they didn't speak because there was nothing to say that was more useful than waiting. Prescott came over. He looked at Eleanor and said, However this goes, what you did reading those contracts, finding the notary, we'd have lost this without that. You would have found it eventually, Eleanor said. Maybe, Prescott said, but eventually is sometimes too late. He put his hat back on. My wife wants you to come to dinner when this is settled. She doesn't invite people lightly. Tell her I'd be honored, Eleanor said. Prescott nodded and moved away. Thomas looked at her sideways. You're becoming essential to the whole region, he said. I'm becoming known, she said. That's different. Is it? She thought about it. No, she admitted. I suppose not. The commissioner's aide appeared at the door. Everyone filed back in. The commission chair read the decision in the particular flat tone of a man reading something official, and Eleanor listened to every word and translated it into meaning as it came. The commission found federal jurisdiction established. The commission found the drought provision language to constitute material misrepresentation under territorial contract law as applied to federal land interests. The commission voided all 7 existing contracts. The commission ordered Western Territorial Water and Land Associates to make all 7 affected ranchers whole for any costs incurred during the contract period. The commission referred the matter of Edmund Whitmore and the company's principals to the Federal Land Office for investigation of coordinated fraud. That last part was the part Eleanor hadn't been certain they'd get. That last part was the part that meant Edmund Whitmore couldn't simply dissolve this company, create a new one, and try again somewhere else in the territory. Webb turned around from the plaintiff's table and looked at Thomas and Eleanor, and his expression was the expression of a man who has fought a hard fight and won it cleanly. Thomas said nothing. He put his hand over Eleanor's and held it. She turned her hand over and held his back. In the gallery, Crane had already stood and was speaking in low, tight words to the alderman attorneys. Crane's face finally looked exactly like what it was, the face of a man who had spent years moving through territory as though it belonged to him and had just discovered it didn't. Eleanor watched him for a moment. She felt no particular triumph about it. Triumph was a feeling for people who hadn't been certain of the outcome. She had been working toward this specific end for 8 weeks, with the specific conviction of a woman who knew what she had and knew what it meant, and now the thing had happened the way it was supposed to happen, and what she felt was not triumph, but the clean, substantial satisfaction of work completed correctly. It was enough. Outside in the hallway afterward, Clara was standing alone near the window. Eleanor went to her. Clara looked up. Her eyes were tired and clear in equal measure, the specific expression of someone who has done something difficult and irreversible and is only beginning to understand the full weight of it. "How are you?" Eleanor said. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "Ask me in a week." "What will you do?" "Go back to Denver. Talk to my father." A pause. "He's going to be furious." "Yes, and then he's going to be frightened." Clara's mouth tightened slightly. "That's worse with him. The fury I can handle. The frightened version of him is harder." Do you have people in Denver friends' family beyond your father? Some. Clara looked at her. Mrs. Reed. Eleanor. Clara was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, I need to ask you something. Ask. When you were in there listening to me testify about what my father said, what he did, were you angry at me for what I was part of, even without knowing? Eleanor thought about it honestly. No, she said. I was watching you hold to something hard. It's difficult to be angry at someone doing that. Clara looked at her with something that was gratitude and something else underneath it, a recognition of the kind that happens rarely between people who have seen each other at an uncomfortable proximity and found the result was not what they expected. You're not what I thought you were, Clara said, for the third time. But it meant something different every time she said it, and this time it meant the most. Neither are you, Eleanor said. Clara almost smiled, the real version, not the arranged one. Take care of him, she said quietly. He takes care of himself, Eleanor said. I just work beside him. I know. That's what I mean. Clara picked up her bag. Goodbye, Eleanor. Goodbye, Clara. She walked away down the hallway, and Eleanor watched her go and thought, she's going to be all right. She didn't know exactly why she believed that, but she did. Some people you could see the steel in even when they were at their most uncertain, and Clara Whitmore had steel that she'd only just started learning how to use. It would hold. Thomas was waiting near the building's entrance talking with Webb when Eleanor came back. Webb looked satisfied in the thorough way of attorneys who have done their best work. Thomas looked at Eleanor when she appeared, and something in his face shifted, relaxed maybe, or opened like a man who had been holding something and has finally put it down. She all right, he said. She will be. Webb shook both their hands. I'll handle the follow-up filings. The ranchers will get their notifications within the week. The Federal Land Office referral will take longer. That process has its own timeline, but it's moving. He looked at them both. You built a good case, both of you. This was not a small thing you did. We had good material to work with, Eleanor said. Honest people who were willing to say what happened. Half the cases I lose are lost because honest people won't say what happened, Webb said. Never take that for granted. He left them at the steps. Thomas and Eleanor stood in the afternoon light of Cheyenne with the noise of the street around them and the particular silence that settles between two people after something large has ended. What do you want to do? Thomas said. What do you mean? We have a few hours before the evening stage. What do you want to do with them? She looked at him. I want to walk somewhere, not talk about water rights or contracts or commission procedure. I want to walk and not think about any of it for 2 hours. I know a good street, he said. Then show me. He offered his arm, not the careful half gesture she'd grown used to in Silver Creek, where he'd always been conscious of being seen and what being seen together meant for her, but the full, unhesitating offer of a man who had stopped factoring that calculation in. She took it. They walked. He told her things on that walk that she understood he didn't often tell anyone. About the ranch in the early years before it was profitable, the winters he'd been genuinely unsure they'd come through with the herd intact the spring, when the creek had flooded and taken out a full season's fence line, and he'd rebuilt it alone because he hadn't had money for help. About his father's last years, and the particular grief of watching a strong man become small. About the 3 years after Clara left, which he described not with bitterness, but with the careful honesty of a man who has fully looked at a hard time and stopped needing to defend himself about it. I thought I was done with that part of life, he said. The part where you let someone in. What changed your mind? A letter from Ohio that told me the truth instead of trying to sell me something. She looked at the street ahead of them. I almost didn't send it, she said. I wrote 4 drafts. The first 3 were more strategic, more carefully positioned. What made you send the 4th? It was midnight and I was too tired to be strategic anymore. She paused. And I thought if this man is what his advertisement suggests he might be, then the truth is the right thing to send him. And if he's not, then a lie wouldn't have helped anyway. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I'm what the advertisement suggested," he said. "I think?" "Yes," she said. "You are, and more." They stopped at the corner because the street ended and the next one began, and Thomas turned to look at her directly in the full afternoon light, the way he had on that first day in Silver Creek, with the same quality of attention, the looking that saw without flinching, without the half-second of adjustment that everyone else needed. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas, I love you." She held very still. "I know we're still," he began. "I know what we're still," she said. "And I know what we're becoming." She looked at him. "I love you too. I have been working very hard not to say it until I was certain." "Are you certain?" "Yes." "What made you certain?" She thought about all the possible answers. The night on the porch. The hand over hers on the table. The coffee he brought when she was buried in documents. The way he'd gone still when she said we built this together, and had not argued with her, had not redirected or deflected, had simply accepted it as true. "You treat me like someone who has always deserved to be here," she said. "Not like someone you're making allowances for. Not like someone you're being patient with. Like someone who was always supposed to arrive." He looked at her for a long moment. "You were," he said. "I just didn't know it until you got there." She reached up and put her hand against his face. The gesture she had never allowed herself, the one she had held back, because it required a certainty she hadn't trusted herself to have. His face was warm and real and exactly as it was, and he covered her hand with his without moving, without making more of it than it was, which was how he did everything. "Take me home," she said. "Yes," he said. The stage back to Silver Creek left at 5 o'clock, and they were on it, sitting close the way people sit when they've stopped negotiating the distance between them and Eleanor, watched Wyoming go past the window in the long gold of late afternoon, and thought about the woman who had stepped off a different stage 7 months ago and apologized for existing. That woman was still her. She hadn't become someone different. She still had the birthmark and the history and all the years of learning to navigate a world that noticed her face before it noticed her. That hadn't changed and wouldn't. But something else had. She had stopped apologizing. Not in a dramatic, declared way. Not in the way of someone who had decided to perform a different version of themselves. In the quiet, solid way of a woman who had built something real alongside another person, and had learned in the building of it that she had always been enough, that the world's failure to see that had been the world's failure, not hers. It had taken 25 years and 900 miles, and one man who read an honest letter at midnight in Ohio and wrote back. She would take it. Thomas's shoulder was warm against hers. She closed her eyes. She did not think about water rights, or federal commissions, or Edmund Whitmore's attorneys. She thought about a place on the North Range where you could see 4 mountain peaks that Thomas had never shown anyone, and had been saving for someone who deserved to see it. She thought about how he had said she was that person. She thought about how she was beginning to believe him. That was the biggest thing. The thing that had taken the longest, and cost the most, and mattered more than any court decision handed down in any room in Cheyenne. She was beginning to believe him. The stage rolled on through the Wyoming evening, carrying them home. The notifications went out to the 7 ranchers the following week, exactly as Webb had promised. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Prescott rode over to tell them he'd received his. He came to the door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she hadn't seen on him before. Something loosened, something that had been clenched for months and had finally let go. "It's done," he said. "It's done." Thomas confirmed. Prescott looked at Eleanor. "My wife sent this." He held out a jar of preserved peaches. "She said to tell you she'd never met a woman who read faster or thought straighter." Eleanor took the jar. "Tell her that's the finest compliment I've received in Wyoming." "I'll tell her." He put his hat back on. "Dinner still stands. Saturday, if you're willing." "We're willing," Thomas said. Prescott rode out. Thomas turned to look at Eleanor, and she was already setting the jar on the shelf in the particular way she had of absorbing good things carefully, without making too much of them, as though joy were a thing that needed to be handled gently, or it would startle and leave. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. I didn't say anything. You were going to say that it's over and we should take a breath. A pause. I was going to say, you should be proud of yourself. She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, looking at her with that expression she had finally found the right word for. It had taken her 7 months. The word was home. He looked at her the way a place looks when you've been away from it long enough to know what it means. I'm proud of what we did, she said. That's not the same thing. No, but it's what I have right now. She looked at him. Give me time. I've got nothing but time, he said.
Captain.
The federal investigation into Edmund Whitmore opened 3 weeks after the commission hearing, and Webb wrote with the news on a Thursday that was otherwise ordinary. Eleanor had been mending fence with Cal because 2 of the hands were down with a winter cold, and the work didn't stop because people were sick. She read the letter at the table when she came in, and then read it again to make sure she'd understood it correctly. Webb says the Federal Land Office found 2 other territories where Whitmore's companies ran the same scheme, she told Thomas at supper. Colorado and Montana, different company names, same contract structure, same notary approach. Thomas set his fork down. How many ranchers? 23 total across 3 territories. He was quiet. Webb says the federal case is going to be significant, Eleanor said. He used the word significant 3 times in one letter, which I think means he's trying not to use the word large. Clara, Thomas said. Yes, she's going to be central to the federal case now, not just the commission hearing. Webb says she'll need her own attorney. Does she have one? He doesn't know. He's trying to reach her in Denver. Thomas pushed back from the table. I need to send a wire. To Clara. To Porter, my friend in Denver. The one who warned us she was coming the first time. He was already standing. Porter knows good attorneys in Denver. Clara shouldn't be walking into a federal case without someone in her corner. Eleanor looked at him. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Go send the wire. He went. Eleanor sat at the table and thought about the particular quality of a man who, in the middle of managing the fallout of something done to him, stopped to make sure the person who'd helped set it right had what she needed. She thought about that for a long time. Kick. Porter came through. Clara had an attorney by the end of the week, a woman which was unusual enough in Denver that Webb mentioned it twice in his follow-up letter, and which Eleanor thought was probably exactly right for Clara's particular situation. Someone who understood what it cost to stand up against a powerful man when that man was your father. A letter came from Clara herself 10 days later. Short. Clara's handwriting was precise and controlled, and gave almost nothing away, which meant Eleanor read between every line. Dear Eleanor, the attorney Mr. Porter found is named Margaret Hale. She is formidable. My father is not speaking to me. I am finding this easier than I expected and harder than I expected simultaneously, which I gather is how these things go. I wanted you to know that I don't regret it. The testimony, any of it, I think that matters, so I'm telling you. Clara. Eleanor read it twice, and then wrote back the same day, which was not something she did reflexively. She was not a reflexive letter writer, had always been deliberate about correspondence, but the letter deserved an answer the same day. She wrote, The fact that you don't regret it is everything. Hold that. The rest will arrange itself around it. She sealed it and gave it to Thomas to take to town. He came back that evening and said, You wrote to her. Yes. Good, he said, and didn't ask what she'd said. The North Range ride happened on a Saturday in late October, when the air had the cold clarity of a sky that has decided to be serious about winter. Thomas had mentioned it the morning before. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. She had said, the weather will hold. She had no particular reason to believe that. She simply needed it to be true, and so she said it. The weather held. They rode 2 hours out from the ranch into territory Eleanor hadn't yet covered, and the land changed as they went, opened up in ways that made her understand what Thomas had meant about the East and the green, and the year it took to stop missing it. This wasn't green. This was something else. something that required different eyes. She had been developing those eyes, she realized, without noticing. Thomas stopped his horse. She stopped beside him, and she saw it. She had not expected to be affected by it. She was a practical woman, and she had been in Wyoming long enough to understand that its landscapes required a different kind of response than Ohio's, and she had been managing that adjustment with the measured approach she brought to most things. She was not managing it now. 4 mountain peaks, the way he'd said, but the word peaks was insufficient, the way most words were insufficient for the actual scale of the thing. The sky was doing something specific with the light at that hour, throwing it sideways and long, and the whole range ahead of them looked like the opening of something rather than the end of anything. She didn't speak. Thomas didn't speak either. After a long time he said, "Worth the 2 hours. You should have brought me here in the first week," she said. She felt him smile rather than saw it. "I needed to wait until you were ready to stay," he said. She turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "There's a difference between showing someone a place and giving it to them," he said. "The first week I didn't know yet if you were going to be here long enough for it to mean something. I didn't want to give it away on a woman who might leave. And now I know you're not leaving." "How do you know?" He looked at her with the directness that had been one of the first things she'd understood about him. The specific courage of a man who has decided to stop protecting himself from the truth of what he wanted. "Because you stopped talking about leaving about 6 weeks after you arrived," he said. "I know because I was listening for it. Every conversation those first weeks there was a door in everything you said. An exit you were keeping clear." He paused. "And then one day it was gone. I don't even know exactly when, but it was gone." She thought about that. He was right. She had been keeping that door clear. It had been the oldest habit she had never fully arriving anywhere, because anywhere could ask you to leave, and it was better to be half gone already than to be all the way here and then forced out. She didn't know when she'd closed that door either, but she knew it was closed. "This place is mine now," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," he said. "Not because of you, or not only." "I know," he said. "You earned it, same as I did." She turned back to the mountains. They stayed until the light started going, and then they rode home in the easy quiet of 2 people who had run out of the need to fill silence. November arrived, and with it the first serious cold, and the ranch shifted into its winter mode. A different rhythm, slower in some ways, and more demanding in others. Eleanor learned the winter version of everything she'd learned in fall. The extra feed management for the herd. The importance of checking the water lines before they froze. The particular cabin fever tension that could build in a bunkhouse of men who'd been inside for 3 days, and how to diffuse it before it became something that required Thomas's intervention. She diffused it twice with food once, with a calm and specific conversation with the 2 men at the center of it, and once by asking Cal to reassign work in a way that separated the problem without making the separation obvious. Cal looked at her after the last one and said, "You've done this before." "I managed 12 women in a laundry," she said. "Tension management was part of the job." "The boss knows he's lucky," Cal said. "The boss works very hard," she said. "Same as the rest of us." Cal shook his head slowly the way he did when he thought she was being deliberately modest, which she occasionally was and occasionally wasn't. Winter deepened. The letters from Webb came less frequently, which he'd said would happen. The federal investigation moved on its own timeline, separate from the commission work, and they were no longer central to it. Clara's attorney was handling the Whitmore family aspect. The 7 ranchers had their contracts voided and their costs reimbursed. The thing was done in the ways it could be done, and the rest was in other hands. Eleanor found that she was all right with that. She had always been someone who needed to see a thing through, who felt the specific restlessness of unfinished work. But this was finished. Or finished enough. The rest, the federal process. Whatever happened to Edmund Whitmore, the legal aftermath that would continue in rooms she'd never see, that was the part that belonged to other people, and she could let it go cleanly. She let it go. And what she had left when she let it go was her life, her actual life, not the waiting room version she'd been living for the first 7 months. The ranch and the people in it, and the work that was genuinely hers now, and Thomas. Thomas most of all. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in December that she would remember for the rest of her life, not because of what it said, but because of what came after it. It was from Mrs. Aldridge in Columbus, the woman who ran the Women's Center, the woman who had forwarded Eleanor's letter to Thomas all those months ago, and who wrote now a short warm letter to say she had heard from Thomas directly that the marriage had taken, and that she was pleased, and that she had thought it would. "I thought it would from the first," Mrs. Aldridge wrote, "because you were the only one who told the truth about yourself. In my experience, the people who can do that are the ones who know how to love honestly, and that is the only kind of love that lasts." Eleanor read the letter at the table. Thomas came in from outside, looked at her face, and said, "Good news, or complicated news?" "Good news," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge in Columbus." "What does she say?" Eleanor folded the letter. "She says she thought it would work from the beginning." "Smart woman." "Yes." She set the letter down. "Thomas." "Yes." "She says the reason she thought it would work was that I told the truth about myself in the letter." He poured coffee and sat down across from her. "She's right. She says people who can do that are the ones who know how to love honestly." Eleanor looked at him. "I want you to know that I didn't know how to love honestly before I came here. I knew how to be honest. That's different. Honesty without love is just accuracy. It doesn't cost anything." He was listening with his full attention, the way he always listened when she said something that mattered. "I learned the other part here," she said. "The part where honesty costs something because you're telling the truth to someone you can't afford to lose." She paused. "You're the first person I haven't been able to afford to lose. I thought you should know that." He set his cup down. He said, "Eleanor." "Yes." "Come here." She stood up and came around the table, and he stood to meet her and put both arms around her, the way he had never quite done before. Not the careful gestures of a man managing his own hope, but the full unreserved hold of a man who has stopped managing anything. She pressed her face against his shoulder. She didn't touch her cheek. She didn't check herself. She didn't do any of the things she had spent 25 years doing automatically, the constant small self-monitoring of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She just stood there, in her own kitchen, in her own home, in the arms of a man who had read an honest letter at midnight and written back and meant every word of every letter after. "You're not going anywhere," he said into her hair. Not a question. "No," she said. "Good," he said. "Because I've been building this place for a long time, and it finally feels like it's the right size." She laughed. An actual laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that didn't ask permission first. He held on. Christmas came to Silver Creek, and with it, the particular warmth of a community that had been through something hard together and had come out the other side with a clearer understanding of who they were to each other. The harvest supper at the Prescotts had turned into a regular gathering. Eleanor and Thomas the Prescotts, the Dawsons, Fitch and his wife Martha Howell from the general store, and her husband. People who had been neighbors in the functional sense, and were becoming neighbors in the real sense, which was a different thing entirely. Eleanor taught Margaret Dawson's daughter to sew on a Tuesday afternoon in January, and came home to tell Thomas, who said, "You've become the person people send their children to," with a tone that meant he found this both unsurprising and satisfying. "She's a quick learner," Eleanor said. "So are you," he said. "You learned Wyoming faster than anyone I've seen." "Wyoming's not complicated," she said. "It just requires you to stop expecting it to be something else." He looked at her. "Same could be said for most things," he said. "Most things," she agreed. Spring came. The way it always comes in Wyoming. Not gently, not the soft Ohio spring Eleanor had grown up with, but decisively, as though the land had been waiting for permission and then taken it all at once. The creek ran high. The cattle moved differently, restless with the change. The ranch hands were louder, lighter, the winter tension gone. Eleanor stood in the yard on the first morning that felt like spring and breathed it in and thought about the woman who had arrived on a September stagecoach and apologized for existing. That woman's hands had trembled when she shook Thomas Reed's hand. These hands, her hands now, the same hands, but different inside, were still. She heard the yard door, and Thomas came out and stood beside her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." They stood in the spring-smelling air and didn't say anything for a moment. "Webb wrote," Thomas said. "Edmund Whitmore entered a plea agreement with the Federal Land Office. The company's assets in all 3 territories are being liquidated to repay the affected ranchers." Eleanor absorbed this. All 23. All 23. Plus penalties. And Whitmore barred from land and water rights dealing in the territories for 15 years. Webb says that's the practical equivalent of the end of his business given his age. She nodded slowly. "Clara," she said. "Webb says she's been formally cleared of any involvement. Her testimony is cited in the agreement as materially contributing to the resolution." Thomas paused. She did it. She held. Eleanor thought about a woman in a blue dress walking into a federal hearing room, alone with no armor except the truth she'd decided to tell. "I knew she would," she said. "Did you—" "She had steel," Eleanor said. "She just hadn't used it before." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "Last fall, when I took you to the North Range, I told you I'd waited because I needed to know you were staying." "Yes. I want to ask you the same question I should have asked you then." He turned to look at her fully. "Eleanor Reed, are you happy?" She looked at him. The question was so direct and so— Thomas, no framing, no prelude, no protective qualification. Just the question he actually wanted answered. She thought about all the possible answers. The accurate ones, the careful ones, the ones that hedged because she had spent 25 years hedging as a survival strategy. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach who had rehearsed an apology for 900 miles. She thought about the first night in this house pressing her hand to her cheek in a strange room in Wyoming, telling herself she was still herself, still here. She thought about documents spread on a kitchen table, and a man who asked her opinion and then used it, and hands held on a porch under a sky full of impossible stars, and a letter from Columbus that said the people who tell the truth about themselves are the ones who know how to love honestly. She thought about a laugh that didn't ask permission. "Yes," she said, "I am. Not despite everything. Not despite anything," she said. "Because of all of it. Every part." He nodded. The slow, single nod she had come to understand was his version of everything he couldn't quite say. Then he reached over and took her hand the way he did now, without thinking, without the deliberateness of the early months, without the careful calculation of the appropriate moment. Just reached over and took it, because she was there, and it was morning, and this was their life. She held on. And Eleanor Hayes, Eleanor Reed, who had spent 25 years believing she was a mistake. The world kept making stood in the Wyoming spring, with her husband's hand in hers, and understood fully and finally, without qualification or condition, that she had never been a mistake. She had been the answer. She just had to travel 900 miles to find the question. And from that morning on in the life they built together on that land, in the home that finally held the right number of people in it, in the years that came one after another with their ordinary griefs and extraordinary graces, she was never, not once, anything less than exactly where she was supposed to be. Home, completely, irrevocably. Home.